Chapter 7. The Quiet Mechanics of Focus. Focus is rarely lost in a single dramatic moment. It erodes through small leaks, through a steady dispersion of attention into places that feel necessary but are not. A person sits down to do serious work and finds themselves moving in and out of contact, never fully absent but never fully inside the task. By the end of the day, they can explain in detail what they did. What is harder to explain is why the day felt heavy and why the most important work remained partly untouched. The usual explanation is emotional. People blame stress, mood, motivation, or the vague sense that their mind wasn't there. These descriptions are not wrong, but they are incomplete. Focus is not only a feeling state, it is an environment the mind inhabits. It has structure. When structure is missing, the mind does what it always does. It improvises. It fills the space with default behaviors, checking, scanning, reacting, narrating, until the work becomes a backdrop for a stream of small impulses. The architecture of focus is the set of conditions that makes sustained attention more likely than sustained drift. Most people treat this architecture as aesthetic or optional. They think of it as productivity culture, as a nice-to-have, as something that matters only for certain kinds of knowledge work. In reality, it is as foundational as lighting in a workshop. Good lighting does not do the work for you, but without it, you will cut wrong, measure wrong, and tire faster. The mind behaves the same way. It can operate in poor conditions, but it will spend more energy compensating, and the compensation will feel like effort without traction. One of the most important features of this architecture is constraint. The mind focuses more easily when the field is narrowed deliberately rather than collapsed by stress. A deliberate narrowing is different from tunnel vision. Tunnel vision is panic-shaped. Deliberate narrowing is intention-shaped. It is the act of deciding what belongs in the room and what does not, then honoring that decision long enough for the work to deepen. Deep work is not a mood, it is a depth created by time spent on the same surface. The surface may be writing, analysis, design, planning, problem-solving, or the careful sequencing of a complicated project. The mind does not drop into this depth instantly, it descends. It needs continuity to do that. The architecture of focus is therefore less about forcing concentration and more about protecting continuity. Continuity is fragile because the mind is opportunistic. It notices possibilities constantly. It notices the unfinished message, the unanswered email, the slightly uncomfortable feeling in the body, the thought that something important might be missing. These notices are not mistakes. They are part of how cognition works. The problem begins when every notice is treated as a directive. The mind becomes a dispatcher of micro-urgencies, and the worker becomes someone who responds to each one automatically, believing responsibility is responsiveness. Responsibility, in the context of focus, often looks like the opposite. It looks like choosing a narrower contract with the moment. It looks like allowing certain things to remain unanswered long enough for something deeper to be built. It looks like accepting a short-term discomfort, the discomfort of not resolving every impulse immediately in order to gain a longer-term clarity that comes only from sustained engagement. This is where emotional interference typically enters. Emotion does not usually destroy focus by being overwhelming. More often, it destroys focus by making the mind twitchy. A mild anxiety adds urgency to everything. A mild irritation makes interruptions feel personal. A vague insecurity makes the worker check more often for feedback or confirmation. A sense of boredom makes the mind hunt for stimulation. These states are not catastrophic, but they change what the mind considers urgent, and urgency is the solvent of depth. The architecture of focus counters urgency by changing the default meaning of interruption. An interruption does not have to be resisted with force. It can be treated as a normal event in the mind's atmosphere. A thought arises, a feeling shifts, an impulse appears. The architecture is what prevents these events from becoming exits. In a poorly structured environment, the mind treats each event as a doorway and walks through it. In a well-structured environment, the mind treats each event as weather moving through a closed room. A closed room is not an act of isolation from reality. It is an act of protecting the reality you actually intend to inhabit. Without this protection, the mind will inhabit whatever reality is loudest. Loudness is not always external. Internal commentary can be louder than notifications. The mind can generate a new urgency every few minutes, and if those urgencies are indulged, the day becomes a chain of shallow contacts, each one leaving the work before it had a time to speak back. The mechanics of focus begin with a shift in what is treated as the unit of work. Many people treat work as a set of tasks to complete and treat focus as something needed to complete them. A more accurate view is that the unit of work is the attention block itself. A task is only as real as the attention that stays on it. Without attention, a task becomes a name on a list, a concept about work rather than work itself. Focus is not something added to tasks. It is what makes a task exist in the present moment as something being done. When a worker begins valuing the attention block as the unit, they begin to see interruption differently. A quick check of email is not quick if it breaks descent. A message that takes 30 seconds to read can cost 10 minutes of re-entry. The time loss is not always visible on the clock because the clock measures minutes, not depth. The mind measures depth. Depth is what produces the kind of quality that feels effortless later because it prevented error, prevented rework, prevented shallow thinking that creates complicated problems downstream. This is why focus feels like architecture rather than willpower. Willpower can initiate contact. It is not reliable enough to maintain it. The mind will always generate reasons to leave because leaving provides relief, stimulation, or the illusion of control. Architecture reduces the number of decisions required to stay. It changes the environment so staying becomes the default rather than the heroic choice. A basic piece of this architecture is the elimination of ambiguity at the start. Many people sit down to work with a general intention and then wonder why the mind wanders. A general intention invites wandering because the mind does not know what to grip. If the task is work on the project, the mind will choose whatever part of the project is most emotionally loaded, most uncertain, or most stimulating. It will avoid the dull, necessary pieces and chase the urgent-feeling ones. If the task is draft the next 2 pages or resolve the 3 variables in this estimate, the mind has something with edges. Edges matter. They give attention a shape. The mind also needs a stable surface. A stable surface does not mean a perfect environment. It means an environment with predictable friction. When friction is predictable, the worker can absorb it without negotiation. When friction is unpredictable, the mind becomes vigilant, scanning for what will interrupt next. Vigilance is narrowing. It reduces the ability to descend. This is why certain workspaces feel deadening even if they are quiet. They do not feel safe in a cognitive sense. Something could happen at any moment. A message might arrive. Someone might enter. A decision might be demanded. The mind stays half ready to react, and half ready is not enough for depth. This is also why deep work often feels physically calm. The body, when it senses predictable conditions, releases some of its scanning. The shoulders drop. Breathing steadies. The mind becomes less jumpy because it does not have to keep checking the perimeter. This calm is not a mood that must be manufactured. It is a physiological response to an environment that signals continuity. Emotional interference is often a perimeter problem. The mind keeps leaving because it does not trust that it can stay. It does not trust that staying will be safe, not in the dramatic sense, but in the subtle sense, that staying will not create exposure. Deep work exposes competence. It exposes gaps. It exposes the difference between intention and skill. The mind senses this and attempts to protect the self by making contact shallow. Shallow contact preserves plausible deniability. If you never go deep, you never have to see the full shape of your limitations. The architecture of focus quietly removes deniability by making depth the default. It does not do this through inspiration. It does it through reducing exits. Exits can be physical, like a phone in reach. Exits can be cognitive, like leaving the task to plan endlessly. Exits can be emotional, like indulging a feeling as though it requires immediate resolution. When exits are reduced, the mind is forced to remain in contact long enough for the work to become real. This is where the idea of emotional interference becomes practical. Emotion interferes when it is treated as instruction. A wave of doubt appears, and the worker interprets it as a sign to pause. A spike of anxiety appears, and the worker interprets it as a sign to check for reassurance. A sense of boredom appears, and the worker interprets it as a sign that the work is wrong, or that they should seek stimulation elsewhere. The architecture does not argue with these states. It simply refuses to treat them as exits. It allows them to exist while the task remains the central object. The mind is capable of holding multiple signals at once. It can hold discomfort and still write. It can hold restlessness and still read closely. It can hold uncertainty and still run numbers. The limitation is not capacity. The limitation is the habit of turning every signal into a route away from contact. Focus becomes easier when signals are allowed to remain signals rather than being promoted into events. There is also a temporal component to this architecture. The mind is more likely to go deep when it believes it has enough time to go deep. This belief does not require endless hours. It requires a protected span. When attention expects interruption, it stays in a shallow mode, because shallow mode is efficient for switching. When attention expects continuity, it invests. It becomes willing to explore, to think in longer chains, to revise, to refine. The mind is an investor in its own energy. It will not invest deeply if it expects the account to be closed abruptly. This is why focus often fails in fragmented schedules. The issue is not the amount of time available across a day. It is the number of times the mind is asked to re-enter. Re-entry carries cost. It is not only a cognitive cost, but an emotional one. Each re-entry requires overcoming the discomfort of beginning again. Over time, the mind begins avoiding re-entry by avoiding depth in the first place. It stays at the surface where leaving is painless. The quiet mechanics of focus are therefore not mysterious. They are the mechanics of staying long enough for depth to appear. Depth is the point where a task stops being a set of instructions and becomes a living problem. It is where patterns become visible. It is where solutions begin to take shape. It is where work gains a kind of momentum that feels satisfying because it is not the momentum of rushing, it is the momentum of contact. That momentum is what many people mistake for motivation. They believe they need to feel motivated to work. Often they need to work long enough for momentum to generate the motivation-like feeling. The mind's architecture determines whether this threshold is reached. A worker who reaches it regularly begins to trust a different order of operations. They stop waiting to feel focused. They build focus through protected continuity. They stop trying to eliminate emotion first. They stop treating emotion as the controlling variable. They begin treating emotion as one of many signals occurring inside a room whose main purpose is contact with the task. This changes the meaning of discipline. Discipline becomes less about forcing effort and more about refusing to allow the day to be stolen by constant exits. It becomes an agreement with the work itself, an agreement that depth is valuable enough to protect even when the mind produces reasons to leave. Those reasons will always exist. The mind will always be able to justify a detour. The question is whether detours are the default or whether the task is. When the task becomes the default, focus stops feeling like a struggle against distraction and starts feeling like a gradual settling into reality. The mind may still drift. Drift is human. The difference is that drift is shorter, less consequential, less likely to become a full departure. The worker returns quickly, not because they are heroic, but because returning has been built into the structure of their work. As this structure strengthens, the emotional layer begins to quiet, not because emotions are suppressed, but because the mind is no longer feeding them with constant interpretation and reaction. An anxious thought arises, but it is not given an hour of attention. A restless impulse appears, but it is not granted the steering wheel. A minor irritation flares, but it is not allowed to rewrite the entire afternoon. The emotions still pass through, but the work remains the central surface. The architecture holds, and because it holds, attention can deepen. Deep work, then, is not the absence of emotional life. It is emotional life occurring in the periphery, while attention stays anchored in what is real. That anchoring is not a gift. It is the result of quiet mechanics applied consistently until focus is no longer a rare event, but a familiar place the mind knows how to inhabit.